7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
What if I told you that artificial intelligence just uncovered secrets buried for more than 2 millennia? And those secrets could change how we understand the Bible, history, and even human resilience? This isn't a plot from a sci-fi movie. This is happening right now deep in the Judean Desert, inside a cave chillingly known as the Cave of Horror. For decades, the Dead Sea Scrolls have been one of archaeology's greatest treasures. Discovered in 1947, these fragile parchments rewrote what we knew about the Hebrew Bible and the roots of Judaism and Christianity. But here's the twist. After more than 70 years of study, scholars believe the mystery was mostly solved. Every letter examined, every fragment cataloged, or so they thought. Fast forward to the 21st century. Looters start raiding desert caves for artifacts to sell on the black market. In response, Israeli archaeologists launch a rescue mission, rappelling down sheer cliffs to reach hidden caves before thieves do. That mission led to a discovery no one saw coming: 80 new fragments of ancient scripture, lying in silence for nearly 2,000 years. Fragments that seemed ordinary at first glance, but would soon turn out to hold a secret bigger than anyone imagined. These pieces weren't in Hebrew like most of the scrolls. They were in Greek, yet the name of God was written in ancient Hebrew letters, as if even in translation, the divine name could not be touched. Strange enough, right? But the real shock came when researchers noticed something odd in the handwriting. The letters trembled, they wavered. They weren't the steady strokes of professional scribes. It looked like someone was writing in fear, maybe even while hiding for their life. And that's where artificial intelligence enters the story. Using hyperspectral imaging and machine learning, researchers fed every fragment into systems capable of seeing what human eyes could never detect. What they found sent shockwaves through the academic world. These texts weren't just translations. They were altered, reworked, lines missing, phrases sharpened. Every change carried a message, one that might have been a code of rebellion against the Roman Empire. Let that sink in. For 2,000 years, these fragments sat silent, their writers dead, their story untold. And now, thanks to algorithms and AI, they're speaking again, not as mere scripture, but as a whisper of resistance from people facing annihilation. So what exactly did AI uncover? Why were these verses changed? And what does it all mean for our understanding of faith and history? Stay with me, because the truth hidden inside these fragments is stranger and more human than anyone imagined. The Judean Desert is a place of silence. Its barren cliffs plunge into deep gorges. Its winds scrape across rocks that have watched centuries pass without a sound. To most, it's desolation. But beneath its stillness lies a secret that has outlasted empires. A story of hope, fear, and words written in hiding. Our journey begins in a place with a name that sends shivers down your spine: the Cave of Horror. It's not a name chosen for dramatic effect. It's a name earned. Perched midway down a sheer cliff in the Nahal Hever Gorge, the cave isn't the kind of spot hikers stumble upon. It demands ropes, harnesses, and a strong will just to glimpse its shadowy interior. And yet, 2,000 years ago, someone, maybe many someones, chose this place as their refuge. A last stand, or perhaps a grave. Back in the 1960s, archaeologists first descended into this cave. What they found was haunting. The skeletal remains of nearly 40 individuals, men, women, children, all huddled together in silence, frozen by time. They weren't buried with ceremony. They weren't arranged with care. These were people who had fled with nothing but desperation, and perhaps fragments of faith. Historical clues point to a violent chapter: the Bar Kokhba Revolt of 132-136 AD, a Jewish uprising against the crushing might of Rome. As Roman legions advanced, villages burned and thousands were slaughtered. Refugees ran for the desert. Some made it to Nahal Hever. None made it out. Alongside the bones, archaeologists found something else: small scraps of parchment. Torn, weathered, barely legible. No scrolls in jars like the famous Qumran caves. No neatly stored archives. Just scattered pieces, clinging to survival as fiercely as the people who carried them. At the time, scholars dismissed them as minor finds. After all, the original Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, had already rewritten biblical scholarship. Those scrolls were pristine, stored in ceramic jars with clear intent to preserve. By contrast, these new fragments seemed chaotic, almost accidental. Perhaps just copies, scholars thought, too damaged, too incomplete to matter. But then, the looters came. By 2017, rumors of black market scroll fragments sparked alarm. Desperate to protect what little remained, the Israel Antiquities Authority launched an unprecedented national operation. Teams of archaeologists, soldiers, and expert climbers scoured the Judean Desert, dangling on ropes over yawning chasms, searching every crevice before thieves could strike. And in 2021, their gamble paid off. Deep inside the Cave of Horror, among dust and bones, they unearthed something astonishing. Dozens of new scroll fragments, some smaller than a postage stamp, others large enough to reveal words, and those words carried surprises. First, the language. These fragments weren't written in Hebrew or Aramaic, as most Dead Sea Scrolls were. They were written in Greek, the language of empire, trade, and law under Roman domination. But one detail broke the pattern. Whenever the name of God appeared, it was preserved in ancient Hebrew script. Why would scribes mixing languages stop at that name? Reverence, perhaps, or defiance. A silent statement. Even in a foreign tongue, this name remains ours. The passages themselves came from familiar sources, the book of Nahum and chapter 8 of Zechariah. But context changes everything. Nahum speaks of divine judgment. The mountains quake before him, the hills melt away. Zechariah whispers of restoration after exile. Old men and women will once again sit in the streets of Jerusalem. Imagine those words clutched in trembling hands by people hiding from soldiers, hearing the echo of boots on stone. These weren't abstract scriptures, they were lifelines. Promises inked in the dark as the world collapsed outside. Still, for all their emotional weight, the fragments seemed to offer little new insight, at least to the naked eye. They were cataloged, photographed, and stored. And that might have been the end of the story, if not for a technology no one in the 1960s could have imagined. Enter artificial intelligence. Hyperspectral imaging began revealing traces of ink invisible to human sight. Then machine learning models took over, analyzing handwriting at a level of detail no scholar could match. And what they found changed everything. The letters weren't just messy, they carried patterns of pressure, rhythm, and hesitation, patterns that whispered of fear. The Cave of Horror wasn't a scriptorium, it was a hiding place, a refuge, a tomb. And those fragments weren't routine copies. They were coded messages of faith and resistance, written under the shadow of death. For nearly 2,000 years, their secret lay buried in silence. Until now. For decades, scholars stared at these fragments and saw nothing more than brittle scraps of parchment, words half erased by time. But AI doesn't blink. It doesn't tire. It looks for patterns so small, so imperceptible, they escape even the sharpest human eye. And what it saw in those fragments has changed everything we thought we knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls. It started with hyperspectral imaging, a technique that shines multiple wavelengths of light onto ancient documents, revealing ink strokes that faded centuries ago. This allowed researchers to photograph the fragments in stunning clarity, exposing letters invisible to human vision. But the real revolution came when machine learning stepped in. Algorithms trained on thousands of handwriting samples began studying each fragment pixel by pixel, mapping every curve, every tilt, every pressure point. At first, the goal was simple: piece the puzzle together. Match fragment A to fragment B based on writing style, ink density, and parchment fibers. But then, something unexpected happened. The AI didn't just match fragments. It detected patterns hidden inside the handwriting itself. Variations so minute they suggested more than error or age. They suggested emotion. Take one fragment from the Cave of Horror. To human eyes, the letters looked shaky, inconsistent. But the AI saw more. Micro variations in line thickness, irregularities in stroke angles, fluctuating pressure across individual letters. These weren't random. They matched known markers of tremor-related handwriting. In other words, whoever wrote this wasn't calm. Their hands shook, not from laziness, but from stress, fear, maybe hunger, maybe the distant echo of Roman boots closing in. This wasn't the work of a trained scribe sitting in a quiet chamber. This was the desperate scrawl of someone in hiding, someone who believed their time was short, yet still chose to write. That alone changes everything. For the first time, the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't just theological artifacts. They were human fingerprints on history, fingerprints that trembled. But that was only the beginning. As the AI reconstructed the Greek text, scholars realized it didn't perfectly match the Septuagint, the standard Greek translation of Hebrew scripture. Lines were different, Some verses had been shortened, others sharpened. For example, a verse in Nahum, which in the Septuagint reads with a tone of warning, appeared here as something closer to a battle cry. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. Softer clauses were stripped away. Every word felt deliberate, like a coded manifesto whispered among rebels. Hold on, justice will come. Why change the text? AI can't answer motive, but patterns suggested intentional redaction, the kind you see in propaganda or in letters written to sustain courage under fire. These weren't passive copies. They were active rewrites, shaping scripture into a tool of resistance. Another anomaly. The treatment of the divine name. Every time God's name appeared, it was written in ancient Hebrew script, even though the rest of the text was Greek. AI confirmed this wasn't a one-off mistake. It was systematic. Imagine the symbolism. Surrounded by the language of the empire, God's name stands alone, unbent, unassimilated. Was it reverence or rebellion? Perhaps both. And then came the most chilling discovery. These fragments weren't written by one person. The AI identified multiple handwriting profiles in the same piece of parchment. Some letters were bold and steady, others small and fragile. The rhythm shifted line by line. This suggested a communal act. Maybe parents and children, maybe friends, working together in a cave, copying words they believed mattered more than life itself. In one section, a confident hand begins a verse, but halfway through, a different hand takes over, smaller, hesitant, marked by tremors. Did someone collapse mid-sentence? Did another continue where they left off? Each irregularity raised new questions and painted a picture no history book had ever shown us. A community on the edge of annihilation, holding on to identity with ink and parchment as their only weapons. For scholars, this is groundbreaking. For the rest of us, it's deeply human. These weren't just scrolls, they were lifelines. They were hope in its rawest form, scratched onto scraps by people who knew the odds, but wrote anyway. An AI didn't just decode words, it decoded intent. It pulled whispers from the dust, voices from 2 millennia ago saying, "We were here, we believed, we fought to remember." But here's where the story takes its most dramatic turn. If these scrolls were altered, if scripture itself could be reshaped for survival, what does that say about the texts we've trusted for centuries? Could some of our most sacred traditions have begun as tools of resistance? We're about to explore that, and the implications are staggering. For centuries, archaeology has been a slow art, a brush in the sand, a shard of pottery turning in a palm, decades of debate over a single word. The Dead Sea Scrolls were no exception. When they were discovered in the 1940s, scholars thought the mystery belonged to them alone. They imagined generations poring over ink and parchment, wrestling meaning from every letter. But in 2021, that changed forever, because the most important scholar to ever read the scrolls isn't human, it's a machine. This moment isn't just about deciphering fragments. It's about rewriting the rules of history itself. For the first time, artificial intelligence has moved from being a passive tool, digitizing, preserving, to becoming an active interpreter of the past. It sees what we cannot. It hears voices hidden in fiber and ink. And in doing so, it forces us to confront a question we've never had to ask before. When technology interprets scripture, who is the real author of meaning? Humans, or the algorithms we created? Until now, the Dead Sea Scrolls were considered settled texts. We had photographs, translations, commentaries stacked on shelves. But AI just shattered that illusion. Every fragment scanned, every tremor detected tells us one thing: history is never finished. What we thought was complete was simply limited by eyesight, by patience, by the bounds of human perception. That's the power and the danger of what's happening now. Machines don't get tired. They don't stop at the obvious. They dive into patterns so microscopic they feel almost intimate. A flicker of pressure in a single letter, a hesitation invisible to any scholar alive. And from those patterns, entire stories emerge. Stories about fear, resilience, and intent. Stories that were always there, waiting for something tireless enough to find them. Here's the real disruption. If AI can reveal layers of text we never knew existed, what else might it uncover? Not just about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but about all ancient manuscripts, from Homer's epics to medieval codices. How many lines were rewritten under political pressure? How many verses we treat as absolute were once edited by human hands trembling in caves? For believers, that raises hard questions. Does this discovery shake faith or deepen it? If sacred texts evolved in crisis, does that make them less divine or more miraculous? Perhaps the message isn't in the perfection of the words, but in their survival, scarred yet enduring across empires and ages. For historians, another tension looms. When a machine interprets history, is that still history? Or is it something new? Are we uncovering the past or creating a new version shaped by algorithms that prioritize probability over poetry? And then there's the ethical frontier. These fragments were never meant for us. They were desperate writings, perhaps private prayers, never intended to survive. Now, 2,000 years later, machines are resurrecting their authors' most fragile moments. Is that restoration or intrusion? Do we owe the past its privacy, or do we have a duty to learn, no matter how raw the truth? One thing is clear: the scrolls are speaking again, not loudly, not perfectly, but more clearly than they have in 2 millennia. And the voice isn't just theirs. It's ours, amplified by technology that refuses to let silence win. This is more than archaeology. It's a dialogue across centuries, between ink and algorithm, between hands that shook with fear and circuits that never feel. And maybe that's the most haunting thought of all, that the future of history, of faith, of meaning, might depend not on what we believe about the past, but on what our machines can teach us to hear. 2,000 years ago, in the shadow of Roman legions, someone huddled in a cave with scraps of parchment and ink that might have been their last possession. Their hands trembled as they wrote words of judgment and hope, verses that promised justice in a world collapsing around them. Then silence. The cave became their tomb, and time buried their story, until now. Fast forward to our century. A machine, built from lines of code and algorithms, stares at those same fragments. It doesn't pray. It doesn't fear. It doesn't understand longing or loss. Yet somehow it pulls whispers from dust and gives them back to us. That paradox should make us pause. It took something inhuman to reveal what was most human about these scrolls. And what a revelation it is. We've learned that these texts were not passive relics. They were active lifelines, not carefully copied for posterity, but hastily written in crisis, altered, adapted, infused with urgency. Every irregular stroke, every subtle edit tells a story of resilience. Faith was not a fortress of unchanging words. It was a fire kept alive by people who refused to let the dark win. But here's the question you and I must wrestle with. If AI can uncover truths hidden for millennia, what else might it show us? What if other sacred texts carry similar marks of struggle? How much of what we call unshakable tradition began as whispers of survival in caves like this one? Does that make these words less holy, or does it make them infinitely more so? This discovery also forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. History is no longer a human monopoly. Machines are now our partners in remembering. They can see what we cannot, and in doing so, they shape the story we tell about ourselves. Is that a triumph of progress, or a warning that the interpretation of our past is slipping beyond our control? And finally, there's a more intimate question. One that lingers long after the headlines fade. Why did they write? Those men, women, maybe even children in that cave. Why did they risk everything for words? Maybe because they believed that even if their bodies didn't survive, their meaning would. That someday, someone would read and remember. That someone is us. The scrolls are speaking again, not perfectly, not fully, but enough to remind us that truth is never simple. That faith is forged in fear. And that hope, even when written on scraps of parchment, can outlast empires. So now I turn to you. Do these revelations shake your faith or strengthen it? Do they make Scripture feel less divine or more alive than ever? Let me know in the comments, because this story isn't finished, and neither is the conversation.